Thank you very much, Georgina. Thank you to everyone who's involved in this great evening. This country was built on hard work, on common sense, on passion, on principles. This is the backbone of this great nation, and it's through the work of people like Georgina, Xavier Boffa, Stuart Wood, Ian Callanan, the board of the Samuel Griffith Society, and of course, I can't make it to breakfast, and even if I could, Jacinta, it turns out it's oversubscribed, people like Jacinta Price. You'll get sick of us celebrating, but we have to celebrate. No, we don't have to, we should, and we love celebrating those people, not on our side of politics, but on our side of principles who matter to this country. So can I just again say thank you to every single one of you for what you do and how important it is to this country. It's such a great honour to speak in front of this august crowd and to follow people who are far more learned than I am, who have opened this conference in previous years. None more so than the late and great Roddy Marr. I reread his address launching the first volume of the Society's proceedings from the early 90s recently. And as I said, great people who do important work need to be honoured. They blaze the path that we are fortunate enough to walk on. So I'd like to repeat a few paragraphs of what Roddy said that night many, many years ago. He said, when this society commenced, Mr. Stone wrote to me, Mr. Stone, of course, being the great John Stone. Mr. Stone wrote to me saying that the chattering classes were devoted to this general notion that the Australian Constitution was hopelessly outmoded and needed to be brought from the horse and buggy stage and propelled into the 21st century. Roddy said the society should be formed as an antidote to the chattering classes so that sane and scholarly discussion of constitutional issues could proceed. Well, Roddy, of course, was speaking against the background of the Republican debate the previous decade. He said, there was Patrick White, coaxed out of his mansion, an old curmudgeon in a tea cosy on his head, persuaded to denounce in a fuselage of verbalist sentences the social system which had always cocooned him in his immense wealth. And there was his mate, Manning Clark, said Roddy, who would hint darkly that unless the monarchy was abolished, blood would stain the wattle. And there was Thomas Keneally, Roddy said, ever ready to announce his worship of Whitlam, his devotion to the left and his detestation of anything else. He thinks too little and talks too much, Roddy said. Well, I pine for the chattering classes because those were innocent times. Roddy spoke before social media, before this very modern addiction where at any hour of the day people can reach for their phone to inhale the exhaust fumes of social media to realise just how brilliant they are by only speaking with people that they agree with. Roddy spoke about a time before the new pandemic of moral narcissism, this psychological tendency that others have written about where people think that their moral stance matters more than what they actually do. Roddy spoke before one of the most disgraceful, dishonest referendum debates in our history, the proposal to insert in our Constitution a race-based voice to Parliament. It was before the Me Too movement. It was before vendetta journalism had become an award category at the Walkleys. A grumpy old writer in a tea cosy, I mean, yeah, I'll have that any day over, well, I won't finish that sentence, use your imaginations. Save me a defamation suit. Suffice to say that we have something, I think, far more louder today and therefore far more dangerous. And tomorrow you'll hear from some of the greatest legal minds in the country. And I want to reiterate what Julian Leeser said at the Tasmanian Samuel Griffith conference in 2011. He said, if the values of this society, respect for our Constitution, for federalism, for the rule of law, for judicial modesty, for scepticism, for international law, If these values are to flourish, then we need to convince others who are not so certain about them. When Xavier very kindly asked me to speak tonight, it was many months ago, my mind and life were very consumed still by the Brittany Higgins and Bruce Lerman saga. And I'd like to say that I'm about to deliver a tour de force about our criminal justice system. Alas, the sum total of my knowledge still about criminal law is doing crim law at Adelaide Uni at law school in the late 80s and watching 14 seasons of Law and Order when I should have been studying. That's it. But it turned out I didn't need a law degree or Law and Order to understand the Lerman and Higgins saga, because for me it started and ended with the presumption of innocence. Sure, a lot of other really crazy stuff happened. The Me Too salaciousness, the nutty political twists and turns, the equally questionable activism by many in the media, and now the truly bizarre ACT Integrity Commission investigating not the chief prosecutor whose misconduct has now been confirmed by 2 judges in 2 separate forums, but the man who exposed that wrongdoing. I mean, only in the ACT. Still, what made this saga so compelling for me from the start and to the finish was this question of how the rule of law was holding up. This is not an unimportant question. The Samuel Griffith Society is committed to the fundamental principles that determine how we govern our lives. And if you believe in the presumption of innocence, then very sensible things follow. The media don't undermine a fair trial. Politicians don't get up in our national parliament and undermine the presumption of innocence. Prosecutors will always disclose information to a person presumed to be innocent. It's all quite simple. It should be controversial. I mean, how different that saga could have been if this was controversial. But during the Higgins fiasco, I discovered it wasn't uncontroversial. As one famous Sydney restaurateur tweeted, he said, "We really needed to rethink this whole presumption of innocence thing." Well, as Roddy would say, he cooks too little and tweets too much. But chefs aside, I've learned that many people, many very educated people, even lawyers, don't hold in high regard principles that underpin the rule of law in this country. When I first started writing for newspapers more than 20 years ago, the rule of law was the first issue that I was passionate about. And back then the focus was very much on judicial activism. And my friends, they were lawyers, I only had friends who were lawyers at that stage, said that, oh no one will be interested in that, it's just far too dry for non-lawyers. Well, I disagreed, because this is a question about power. In whom do we vest power? How do we exercise it? How do they exercise it? And what does it mean for those on the receiving end of the powerful? My first piece on the subject caused some strife. It was written in December 1999, and a week later I discovered that it was going to be the subject of a defamation suit. I'd written a very boring piece, in retrospect, on the Aboriginal magistrate Pat O'Shane, and I suggested that she was probably better suited to politics as a profession, that really, given how she exercised power, the bench was not a place for her. Well, as I said, a defamation suit followed, and the only highlight of that dismal time was when Gough Whitlam was called to give evidence for Ms O'Shane and her apparently impeccable reputation. And that day the courtroom was full. Every media organisation in the country was there wanting to get a glimpse of the great man. And the room was especially quiet as he rose, this lion of the left, to get into the witness box for his great friend, Ms O'Shane, and he started to give evidence. He then proceeded to tell the court all the great things that he had done. Ms O'Shane Silk tried to intervene very politely, saying, "But Mr Whitlam, about Ms O'Shane." Anyway, I tell you all that as a distraction, because the final result was that we lost. Ultimately, the High Court wasn't agreeable to our argument that the freedom of political communication should reach judges and not just politicians, but that's a whole other story. I did, though, at the time think that it was the end of my career writing for newspapers, and yet here I am, more than 20 years later, still writing about the rule of law. But if I could just add a tiny, thank you. A tiny little footnote on that, because it's still, it's still a pain. It was not without some satisfaction that some years later, many Supreme Court judges picked off where I left off when it came to Pat O'Shane. More recently, though, of course, the challenge to the rule of law has come from a different group of activists, from those in the Me Too movement. And its impact on the media, on politics and on the legal system has been no less of a wild ride. And I'll offer my observations about the thundering mobs that fueled the Higgins scandal and about my own stoush with the law shortly. But you have a choice to make. I can provide you the MA-rated version where I talk only about the media, or I can give you the R-rated version which covers the role of the media and the politicians, or if you really insist, I can give you the X-rated version which tells you everything about the media, the politicians and the legal system. So you mull over that decision, but let me start with some G-rated, very family-friendly principles about the rule of law. More than 20 years ago, in 2003, I attended it turned out to be a very famous dinner, and I'm sure many of you here tonight would have been at that dinner, where one of our High Court judges, before he was appointed to the High Court, spoke. And I wrote at the time that that was one of the most impressive job interviews that I had ever seen for the High Court. Now, to be fair, I probably hadn't seen too many, but nonetheless, I sat there thinking, this is one heck of a job application. And sure enough, and rightly enough, the Howard government would appoint the man who gave that address, Dyson Heydon, to the High Court soon after. And he was one of our finest judges, along with Ian Callanan. That night, Dyson Heydon described at length this fundamental concept, the rule of law, that restrains the power in a democracy. He said, the rule of law dilutes power, it diffuses it, and yet it also makes it more efficient. He said the rule of law prevents police officers trespassing on and seizing private property or holding citizens without trial or other hearing. He said, yet it permits and facilitates the procurement of evidence in a regular way with a view to the convincing demonstration of criminal guilt in due course. And I emphasise these phrases deliberately. He said the rule of law prevents citizens from using self-help against other citizens so far as their arbitrary might permits. Mobs, he said, are not able to loot or lynch their enemies at will. Still writing about the rule of law a few years later, and still judicial activism, I had the great fortune to visit the US Supreme Court Judge Antonin Scalia while I was in Washington, DC. And he was at the time the second most senior judge on the US Supreme Court, routinely described as the court's premier conservative intellectual gladiator, eviscerating, I think in his own words, what he called the smug assurances of a modern age. And meeting him was something else. It was literally like meeting someone who'd walked off the set of The Sopranos. This New Jersey-born and Italian-bred judge met me with a pugnacious handshake. I could barely move my arm for a day. He yanked off his coat, he sat in his chair, and he was provocative and gruff and acerbic and funny and brilliant. And we discussed one judgment from 1993 where he compared an earlier decision that his fellow Supremes seemed to like more than he did, which he described as some ghoul in a late-night horror movie that repeatedly sits up in its grave and shuffles abroad after being repeatedly killed and buried. And it reminds me, when I think back on the Higgins and Lerman saga, it just won't die. That sunny morning in DC, Scalia said to me that the law does not need to be dull. And I agree, but I do wish that the Higgins thing had been a little more dull. I wanted to interview Scalia back then because it was 2008, we had a Labor government, and Kevin Rudd and the then Attorney General Robert McClellan were champing at the bit to introduce a Charter of Rights. I mean, have we ever had a Labor government that doesn't want to introduce a Charter of Rights? Well, to erstwhile supporters of judicial adventurism, these were exciting times. Scalia warned us, through that interview with me, against doing so. He said that it would be a licence to judicial activism. He scoffed at judge-made law, at the current orthodoxy that says that a country's constitution is a living document that unelected judges can alter according to the political and social fashions of the time. For Scalia, it came down to a basic understanding of power in a democracy. And in characteristically blunt language, he told me that he prefers his constitution dead, meaning that it must reflect what the founding fathers said. He said to me, if you want to establish a new constitutional right, well, do it the honest way and adopt a constitutional amendment. And that, by the way, was about the only honest part of the Voice referendum. I like to remind people whenever I'm speaking about Scalia that his appointment was approved in 1986 in the US Senate by a vote of 98-0. He told me back then, remembering it was 2008, that he wouldn't have managed to attract 60 votes in the US Senate because of what had happened in the interim was that people had figured out that what the US Supreme Court was doing was rewriting the Constitution from term to term, putting in new rights, pulling out old ones. And if that's what they're doing, he said, by God, the most important thing is I want someone who's going to write the Constitution that I like. Well, challenges to the rule of law come and go. And today the threats are different, but no less serious. A former High Court judge, summed up the challenge today in this way. He said to me, if a man is alleged to have kidnapped, raped and murdered a woman, we've come to the dangerous position in our society where the presumption of innocence applies to only 2 of those very serious crimes. And that brings me to that other ghoulish case that unfolded when Lisa Wilkinson interviewed Brittany Higgins on the project in February 2021. And after the infamous Logie speech the following year, in June 2022, just days out from a criminal trial. Well, these were exciting times for the adherents of the Me Too movement and shockingly challenging times for the rule of law. The Higgins and Lerman saga very quickly became a story about who exercises power and how. I saw the rule of law under attack. I saw institutional failures just about everywhere I looked. And I saw the guarantee of a fair trial turned into a lottery. Our criminal justice system was literally being mocked daily. And writing about this saga from so many times, I kept wondering to myself, was there something about this particular god-awful saga that led so many people, very smart people, to suspend their critical faculties, to exercise such poor judgment, potentially committing contempt and other crimes, breaching professional legal codes, lawyers making false statements to judges, all because they thought that they were doing something so noble that served some higher purpose? Or was this sidelining of the rule of law a deeper problem? Well, this saga was unique in the sense that once Brittany Higgins decided to go to the media with her rape allegation before making a formal complaint to the police, an unstoppable Me Too movement media juggernaut was set in one direction, for Brittany Higgins and against Bruce Lerman. There was a wickedly political element to this juggernaut too. The allegation of a political cover-up by Higgins was pursued by the media with gusto. And yet last month, in a defamation trial between Lerman and network tenant Wilkinson, Justice Michael Lee in the federal court said that there was no evidence to support a political cover-up. Even going back a couple of years before that decision, the mistrial of Bruce Lerman was a fitting end, I think, to the media trial that had preceded it, because the rule of law had come under attack before the trial, and it was no different on that day that a mistrial was announced. Outside the courtroom in front of cameras, flanked by her lawyer and by the ACT Victims of Crime Commissioner, Brittany Higgins expressed her distaste that an accused has a right to silence. But that, along with the rule of law, the presumption of innocence, due process, forms the foundation of our criminal justice system. Higgins was upset that she was cross-examined in court. Well, alas, that too is a critical element of our legal system. Lawyers call cross-examination the truth engine, of the law for good reason. Long before this case reached a courtroom, before the mistrial and after it, I witnessed a number of institutions coalescing to turn the presumption of innocence into the presumption of guilt. And nothing in Michael Lee's defamation judgment alters that. If anything, it confirms, I think, the carnage. Some journalists became crusading activists for Ms Higgins. She became the vessel for those who wanted to use her allegations to further their careers, to preen in public, to win awards, to prosecute the culture at Parliament House in general, and the Morrison government in particular. As Michael Lee said, let me repeat, the allegation of rape was the minor theme, and the allegation of a cover-up the major motif. Lisa Wilkinson appeared at the March for Justice. She took to the stage to accept the Logies. She celebrated the bravery of a complainant just 8 days out from a trial where a man faced serious allegations that, if proved, would see him jailed. The message from Michael Lee in the defamation case was clear. In what universe would lawyers and experienced journalists think that it was appropriate to celebrate a complainant just before a trial? He excoriated the legal advice, the lawyers, and he described Wilkinson as a crusading partisan. The implicit premise of Wilkinson's speech was, as the ACT Supreme Court Justice Lucy McCallum said, to celebrate the truthfulness of the story that she exposed. Many others in the media were guilty of, as McCallum said, obliterating the critical distinction between an allegation and a finding of guilt. The trial was delayed because of the Logie speech and commentary after it. And if we believe in the rule of law, then surely those who interfere with the administration of justice should be prosecuted. But here, many asked whether there were different rules for different people. Justice Lee in the federal court brought contempt proceedings during that defamation trial last month against some random bloke who decided to record parts of the proceedings and post them online. Wasn't what Ten and Wilkinson did to the Logies far worse? It delayed a criminal trial. But McCallum didn't initiate contempt proceedings, neither did the DPP Shane Drumgold. And Michael Lee did express some surprise that nothing had happened. But that wasn't the end of the madness. There were sustained levels of institutional failure elsewhere. Bar associations and law societies struggled to remind us that the rule of law must not fall victim to baying mobs. The National Press Club offered their televised platform to Higgins, who had made these untested allegations, alongside Grace Tame, whose allegations of abuse had been tested and confirmed by a court of law. Placing those two women together clearly blurred the distinction between an untested allegation and a finding of guilt. And proving, if we ever needed proof, that politics is downstream from culture, the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison joined those same forces working against a fair trial. He stood in the National Parliament in February 2022, just months after Lerman had been charged, and apologised directly to the complainant for as yet untested claims and without knowing anything at all about the quality of evidence to support them. If any of these people were in the dock, if their son or father or brother were in the dock, would they have behaved in the same way? Would they want journalists and politicians weaponising a rape allegation made by their daughter in the way that it happened here? In his Board of Inquiry report, Walter Sofronoff KC found that Shane Drumgold had made representations to the Chief Justice Lucy McCallum in proceedings that were untrue and, quote, an invention of his own. Sofronoff found that the DPP was guilty of a serious breach of duty by failing to disclose police investigation documents detailing inconsistencies in Brittany Higgins's version. That he had constructed a false narrative to support a claim of legal professional privilege. Drumgold admitted to all of this. That was the most incredible part of watching those proceedings. He admitted to this. He in fact said that disclosing those documents to the defence during evidence to the Board of Inquiry, he said it would be crushing to Ms Higgins. Well, it would have been crushing to a defendant not to get those police documents. What followed after the Sofronoff report was tabled has been equally ludicrous. It's on the public record that I spoke many times to Walter Sofronoff. Some in the media have been very, very curious to know what we spoke about. Well, I must now disappoint them, finally put them out of their misery, these intrepid sleuths, and tell them we spoke about the rule of law. I spoke to Walter Sofronoff because I was keen to report the inquiry, hearings, and the report fully and accurately. And the idea that I was some kind of Svengali, capable of influencing this esteemed judge, was just comical. I can't influence the views of my children. I don't know what you're doing, Georgina, but I'm clearly doing something wrong. My most loyal dog, a golden retriever, doesn't listen to what I say. It was demented. It's been equally demented that journalists at 9 and the ABC have been demanding that I reveal my sources throughout this saga. Is there no principle that is sacrosanct to these people? Not even a principle that defines how they work every single day, which is that your sources are confidential? At every twist and agonising turn of this saga, the question in my mind has remained, is it just this case that enveloped people, that strangled their critical faculties, or is the issue much wider? Well, in fact, we now know that it is much wider and deeper than this scandal. But there is a silver lining out of this whole thing, thank goodness. There is a new momentum. More and more people are exposing the impact of the Me Too movement on the legal system. Believe all women, as it turns out, is no substitute for the rule of law. Judges in New South Wales have been speaking out. They're concerned that prosecutors are bringing cases that should never reach a courtroom because the evidence is so weak, that lives are being destroyed on insufficient evidence. I mean it when I say that this really has been a hard story to shake. My kids keep saying to me, could you just please go back and write about corporate governance? And I try to explain to them that in many ways this is about governance. It is about the most important form of governance, and that is how we govern ourselves in a free society. But it has been a hard story to shake. One Monday morning in April, I had to have an MRI, and I'm rather claustrophobic, so I really hate MRIs. So I asked for some sedation, but I really hate needles even more, so it was quite frankly a pretty shitty morning. But the radiologist was a really lovely man, and he tried to put me at my ease by chatting to me, and he eventually asked me what kind of work I did, and I said, I wrote for a newspaper. And he said, well, have you followed this Higgins thing at all? And I said, yeah, a little. And he then proceeded to tell me what he thought about the two protagonists and exactly what happened that night. And I told him that I'd never been terribly interested in what happened that night, that no one knows what happened that night except for two people who have two very different versions. I was, however, very interested in whether a fair trial was possible, whether the media were exercising their power responsibly, whether politicians were, and I was concerned that large parts of the legal system were letting us down. But before the doctor left, he turned and said one more thing to me. He said that lawyer, that man who acted for Lerman, he couldn't remember his name, he's a hero. The doctor said he's restored my faith in the legal system. And there were some heroes in this god-awful story. In this racy Me Too age, when the popular thing, an important thing to do, is to act pro bono for a complainant, Steve Whybrow did the very unfashionable thing. He chose to act for a defendant who was deeply unpopular, even hated in many parts of the country, a man who was presumed guilty in those same quarters. And Whybrow did it, as I said, at a tricky time when the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, had ignored the presumption of innocence and sided with the complainant. Whybrow decided that Lerman deserved the defence that the ACT legal aid refused to give him. It's a whole other story. But as noble as all that was, Stephen Wybrow's greatest contribution to the law and to society is about an idea called the rule of law. Ideas, principles, they need champions to survive and thrive. If they're not defended by lawyers, by judges, by people like us, why on earth would the broader community regard the rule of law as central to the equal and fair treatment of citizens in a liberal democracy? Thank you.